over some of the pieces that you'd need to fab a aftermarket rear upper control arm. This is a stock S14 control arm. If you notice, it's only a single-sided, where the S13 has the almost like a circle where the shock goes through the center of it. So what you need is your saddle, which is this piece, your tube, which is going to be like the center section, and then your adjuster and heim joint, which is going to be the replacement for this stock rubber bushing here. If you didn't see the other video where I had these guys made, it's basically a flat piece of steel cut with reliefs, and you bend the reliefs to get this, which becomes this piece. Then for added clearance, use this instead. So it gives you a lot more clearance for the coilover spring, especially on mine because the spring sits so low. And one of the harder parts to come by is this adjuster assembly right here. What it is it's an adjuster with, I think these are 7/8 threads. They could be metric. I measured them with my, not my digital caliper, just a little Empire slide caliper I have. So what it is it's right hand threads on the outside and it's left hand threads on the inside. And what that allows you to do is you run your adjuster piece with the right hand threads, which threads on normal, and then you put your left-handed thread heim joint in, and when you spin this centerpiece, it takes this and moves everything in and out. So you can adjust this on the car and set your camber. The piece, this piece right here, obviously if you had someone custom machine this for you, it'd be a little bit of money. It also has a jam nut. And where I got all this stuff from is there was a set of battle version control arms on Zilvia years ago, and what looked to happen to them is the guy had taken a hit on the wheel and the control arm was bent in the center and cracked. So if I remember right, I picked them up for 50 or 60 bucks, and really the only thing I needed off them was this assembly, which gave me the threaded piece, the adjuster, and these are new heim joints because the heim joints that were on them were not in the greatest shape. And it gave me the spacers. And what the spacers do is they take a 5/8 bore heim joint and adapt it down to 12 millimeter, and then they give it the space it needs to fit in the stock pickup point on the subframe. So 50, 60 bucks for just this adjuster and two of these for two sides was almost worth it. The only thing I did is I turned these down. This is what the old one looked like, obviously, where I cut the old arm off, and I stuck it on the lathe. I turned it down so it just had a nice smooth finish on the outside when I go to weld it. But what I'm also going to do is, if you can see in there, the threads stop about a 1/4 inch from the end, and even with this thing bottomed completely out, the threads won't come anywhere near the end piece, and I need a little more clearance, so I'm probably going to cut another 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch off this adjuster. And that's about it for that. I guess next I will go over setting up the jig. I guess next I'll go over setting up the jig and getting this thing ready to go. Now it's going to be kind of a, not to say a half-assed jig, but I'm not doing a production run of anything on this. So basically all I have to do is I have to set a length, which is this hole to this hole, and as you can see, this control arm is pretty straight in line. If it's off a hair, the heim joint will take care of that. And the only thing I'm using it for is clearancing. So what I did is that control arm, the one that I just kind of mocked up out of spare parts to make sure this cleared, once I get the jig set up, I will put this in the jig, and then what you'll do is you'll make some kind of reference to where this bend is in here. So when you set this whole thing up, you can make sure you have this tube cut and fit so that it lays in and it sits exactly where you need the center of the curve to be so it clears your coilovers. So that will be the next step. Just to show you real quick what I was talking about earlier when I want to trim some more off is that, I mean, I got maybe 1/2 inch clearance. So yeah, if I take another 1/4 inch 3/8 off this, that'll give me plenty of room if I have to adjust this out or adjust this in, which shouldn't be a huge issue because this subframe is raised way up. So with the truck being this low, I'm not going to have to run my control arms at an extreme angle, like everything's going to be up like this. Everything will be, all the arms will pretty much be close to factory settings, so I don't imagine I'll have too much issue with it, but I don't want to get this thing all welded up, good to go, and then figure out that I need to push my camber out a little bit and end up running into the spring. That would not be a good thing, so I'm just going to take care of that before I make these things. Well, the finish on the outside isn't the best, but this is going to get welded. So after it gets sandblasted and powder coated, you'll never know. But now it's got a nice flat face. The face on even the original piece was a little screwed up. It wasn't, when I ran the jam nut down, it didn't lay flat. It was crooked just a little bit because you could see a gap on one side. So yeah, that's, yeah. Oh, I missed a little bit of the paint there. But yeah, this will be a good surface to weld to. I got to put it in some evapor rust anyway because I want to get that threaded adjuster to thread all the way down as far as it'll go. And since this wasn't threaded all the way down for its whole life, the threads in there got some crud on them. So I'm going to soak it in some evapor rust overnight and then brush them tomorrow, and hopefully they come out, because I don't know. This is a weird thread. It's like a super fine 7/8 thread, and I don't know if they make a tap for it, but we'll try the evapor rust in a brush first, see if that works. Where you going, Paul? Hey. What are you doing? What are you doing? See ya. This is evapor rust. It's really good stuff. So what I'm going to do is, the rust is only about, I don't know, 3/4 of the way up in each of these things. And this is an old coffee mug I painted a long time ago. And I found it, and when I found it, I broke it. The handle broke off it. So I was looking for something to put this in. Should be perfect. And just let that sit overnight. Actually, you know what? To hell with it. I'm just gonna put you both down in it. Check on them later. And the next thing is bend the tube. If you're curious on how to set up a die for a bender, I got a video. I think it's called JD2 Model 3 discontinued, because they have discontinued this bender, but It's all about setting up your dies and setting up your spring back and everything else. Now I know with this die, and with this tube, with this wall thickness, that it's a 5-degree spring back, so I want a 90-degree bend, so I'm going to go right to 95, and everything usually comes out within a half a degree. And I know my die stops from my next pickup point at 55 degrees, so I just don't like deadhead in the ram. And that's it, 90-degree bend. And there we go. There's our control arms. Well, parts of them. Alright, so I pulled them out of the evaporust, blasted the holes with a brush, get all the crud out of them. It took a few times working it back and forth, but now they thread all the way up. I already trimmed the ends off. Let me see here. So that's how much I took off the end. Now I'll go put these back in the lathe and just face the ends off, make sure they're both good, and then yeah, start setting up the jig. Alright, if you're asking yourself what the hell that thing is, it's a jig. It's a control arm jig. It's not a mass production control arm jig because obviously if you were doing mass production and building a lot of stuff, it'd be beefier, made out of channel steel, stuff like that, but because I'm only making 2 control arms off this thing, that's why I like using Unistrut, because of the holes, the adjustments. I can put stops in, I can put markers in to tell me where everything's got to go, and I'll show you what I mean by that. This is the mock-up arm that I made, so ultimately this is what I need on the truck. So, good job. There's the mock-up arm, bolted in place. And as you can see, if you look down, you can see there's just a hair gap there, and there's just a hair gap over here where this bolt head is. That is where the loop has to fit with everything else. So what you do now is take all this stuff out. Now is when you put your actual pieces in, and see this down here, it's a stop. What that does is when you put your pieces in here, it stops so it's level with everything else. It won't let it hang down too low. So once that's in, what did I do? Yeah, here she is. And once that's in, now what you do is you take your tube, you place your tube over this, and you start looking where the tube has to go, where it's got to be cut. You figure all your angles out. This is something you learn by doing it over time. I was taught by a guy named Danny when I worked at BMR Fabrication. He showed me how when you put tube on top of stuff and you look over top of it, you make reference lines, you figure out the OD of the tube, and you can actually come in here and basically make 2 cuts on this that will make the fish mouth. You clean it up a little bit and everything fits right in nice. So I'm going to start marking this thing out and then cutting it and fitting it. It might take a couple tries, but we'll get it. Now when I said looking down the tube and seeing where the cut was, this is what I'm talking about. You can take this piece, set it in here, look straight down at the center of this piece, and basically you can see the fish mouth is right there. So you make a cut this way and a cut this way, and you go in with your flapper wheel, your tiger paw, and you clean it up. And then you kind of come in here and start fitting it little by little to make sure it fits. If you've never done it before, cut long. Cut long and grind your way back, because then you're only taking little pieces at a time and you can get this thing to fit like just how you want it to fit. Because if you go in and cut it too short and go to put it in here, if it's too short, it's too short. If it's too long, you can always trim a little more off and keep going. So if you're going to give this a shot, cut it maybe 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch long, and work your way back the first time you try it. Now I gotta go cut this and start working on it. So after the cut, about 5 minutes with the angle grinder and with an 1/8 inch rock wheel on it, and that's what we got. And looks to be pretty good. I actually have a little more gap down here than I did with the old piece, because that old saddle was so big it pushed everything out away from it. So get a little bit of clearance, a little more clearance, should be good. Just some minor touch-up work with a flap wheel, get this flat, good to go, because this whole thing's getting TIG welded out. So yeah, I mean, that's how to build a control arm. But if this was a production jig, like I said, you'd have a piece over here that would, so you could basically take this thing and set it in here right where it wants to sit. Which I might put something out here later, just a little shelf to let this sit on it, because now I know what has to be cut on this and what has to be cut on this, so I can take this on my other and just lay it on that, transfer all the marks over and make the cuts. Now, if this was a production shop making these, like say you had to make 200 sets of these arms, you would have a jig for this jig to cut this tube. And what you would do is you would cut this piece like this, get this all fit up and good, and then well, ultimately you'd have a notcher and some other stuff, but then you would have, let's say, a vertical bandsaw with a slide on it, and you would have a jig set up to where this piece would get clamped into that jig on the slide right where it needs to go. You'd put it in and you'd slide it up and cut these off. And then you'd put it in a notcher, and you'd have the notcher would be set up for this specific piece. So you'd lay it right in there, clamp it down, notch it out, and be done with it. And that's usually how they do it in production shops, but this is just a run of 2, which also on this jig, it can be single-sided, because normally you'd have a left and you'd have a right if something was crazy with this, but everything's in line, everything's straight, both these offsets are the same left or right. So that's the good thing about just making this, call it a down and dirty jig for just making these two pieces. So next I'll be welding it. I don't know if I'm going to put that in a separate episode. I don't know how long this is going to run just doing all this stuff. So if this is the end of the episode, look for welding in part 2. If not, then the welding will probably start right after this cuts out.